And also, please first join me in congratulating Natalia for quite an achievement. So first, the first speaker is Professor Jonathan Zimmerman, who is a professor of education and history at NYU. He's the author of many books. I will mention the most recent one, which is entitled Small Wonder, The Little Red Schoolhouse in History and Memory. Then the second speaker will be Professor Claire Potter from the New School. Her most recent book is Doing Recent History on Privacy, Copyright, Video Games, Institutional Review Boards, Active Scholarships, and History That Talks Back. A long title, but very interesting in all its meanings. And the third speaker will be Professor Jeremy Varon, who is an associate professor of history in the history department here at the New School, and he's the author of Bringing the War Home, The War Underground, the Red Army Faction, and Revolutionary Violence in the 60s and 70s, and more recently, the new life to the students of post-war Germany. Okay, thank you very much, and now the floor is for the speakers.
Just going to change the slide, John, so that they're not distracted as you're going with the dance. It's all yours.
Well, thank you, and welcome to the great lefties of world history. Like, where's Elizabeth Warren here? I keep looking. Yeah, I'm really delighted to be here to celebrate Natalia's book. This is sort of an odd confession, but I've got two daughters who are now in college, and as I watched Natalia develop from a grad student to this incredible scholar, I had this secret wish that my daughters would become just like her. And I'm so delighted that her parents are here to celebrate this as well. I mean, whatever you did, it was good. Just keep on keeping on. Her energy and her enthusiasm, and especially the way that she treats other people with dignity and respect. I'm old-fashioned enough to think that the humanities are about making us better human beings, and that's an ideal that I think that Natalia really embodies. The other one is the one of tolerance, which seems to me at the heart of the entire humanistic enterprise. When I was in grad school, everyone had to read this book by E.P. Thompson called The Making of the English Working Class, and I always used to joke that people just read the intro where he talks about class as a relation, not a thing, and then you would just skip the rest. And there's also that famous line in there where he talks about rescuing working class people from, quote, the enormous condescension of posterity. Well, he did do that. And I would say that in this book, Natalia has done that also, but not for, English mill workers, rather for, middle-class Republican women in Orange County, California. We live in a place and a time where it's incredibly easy to condescend to them. And to a number of other groups, too. I call these free prejudices. So Mormons, they're in that category, no sweat. Evangelical Christians, people who are overweight, you can just go for it, right? The Book of the Talmud or the Book of the Quran, okay, you're not going to put that on Broadway, all right? But we protest everywhere, right? Book of Mormon, not a problem, all right? Done. And that's because you're allowed to condescend in that way. And obviously, if you believe in the humanities, you shouldn't be allowed to. This book takes that population seriously as political actors and thinkers. And also, I hope, retires that canard about cultural issues displacing economic ones. The what's the matter with Kansas interpretation is condescending. If you say to somebody that they don't understand their own economic interests, and they're using cultural issues more precisely, have blinded them to their fundamental economic interests, you are condescending to them. You're telling them that you actually understand their interests better than they do. And this book doesn't do that. I mean, this book reminds us that all those things have always been intertwined. and the attempt to separate and segregate them into cultural and economic arguments is a fool's errand and a condescending one. Finally, I think what the book shows is a triumph of a certain kind of pluralism, a certain kind of consensus on pluralistic assumptions as a philosophy and as a doctrine. My favorite quote in the whole book is from these San Diego right-wingers who later in the book, one of them says, "I respect different cultural values and mores which exist in my community." That's become a kind of shared doctrine, which in first glance seems like a terrific and salutary thing, because obviously we haven't even had a rhetorical consensus on that idea for most of our history. And yet, reading Natalia's book again, and I've read many versions of it, I might add, I wonder if liberals won the pluralistic battle but lost the war. Insofar as public schools themselves have come under a new kind of threat, which my colleague Diane Ravitch calls privatization. You don't have to buy everything that Diane says, and I definitely don't, to see things like vouchers and charters, and especially homeschooling, as a kind of institutional fruit of Natalia's pluralism. Given our differences in this need to respect all these communities, the best compromise is usually to let different communities, parents, other groups, choose their schools. Let 100 flowers bloom, 1,000. I think there's this subtle and important link between pluralism and privatization that Natalia's book really, I think, calls our attention to. And that worries me too, I have to admit, because in some ways I think that this moment, our moment, puts off the hard work of asking and maybe even answering what should bind us together as a nation. Educational politics, one would hope, should be educational in their own right. And in the ideal integrative, they should force us to come together to decide who we want to be and who we want our kids to be. So at one point, when he's talking about this great moral guidelines committee, Natalia says that these new moral guidelines in California represent the development of an organic Americanism among citizens struggling to find solid common ground on rapidly shifting foundations. But he says the debate also, quote, portended an age in which Americans would find said universalism in the public sphere increasingly elusive. I would say right. And I'd submit that we still have to find some sort of solid common ground that's become yet more elusive because of the ideological pluralism that Natalia has documented. And it's increasingly taking the form of institutional pluralism. So under those circumstances, how will we teach everyone what it means to be an American? I want to submit to you that that is not just an academic question. That, in the age especially of things like Charlie Hebdo, that it's actually become a life or death one. In France right now, they're debating what went wrong in the school system, so that, to allow people that were actually produced by the school system to come to the conclusions that they did. And I think it's not long before we're going to be asking the same questions here. Those questions are real. It is coming here, and we do need a shared system in order to answer them. Thanks a lot.
That was great. Thank you very much. Like Jonathan, I want to begin with just a small nod to my friendship with Natalia. We first met at the Schlesinger Library, which used to hold these summer sessions where historians would gather on a particular topic, and ours was history after 1968. We lived in the dormitories, the old Radcliffe dormitories, and we ate in a dining hall, and there were all these activities, and so it was very easy to think about it as summer camp, and actually very quickly we began to call it Nancy Cott's Summer Camp for Historians, which I don't think Nancy thought was very funny, but we did. And one of the things Natalia said one day at lunch is, my parents would send me to summer camp, and there are all these sports and activities and arts and crafts, and I just wanted to talk about books and ideas. So now you can for the rest of your life. So I would like to address Natalia's book from a different angle, which is going to sound dull, which is historiography. And then I want to talk about what I learned from it. Something happened in U.S. history about 20 years ago, which is historians discovered conservatism. And it's interesting to me now that I am researching feminism in the 1970s and 80s. In fact, the Reagan victory in 1980 took feminism completely by surprise. I mean, it's actually kind of astonishing. If you look in the archives, there are all these women like Robin Morgan and Kate Millett and Gloria Steinem writing to each other and saying this is a catastrophe, I had no idea this could happen. And historians didn't either. And part of what was interesting about the historiography is that U.S. historians kind of woke up and said, huh, something was happening, and we weren't paying attention to it. We were not writing about it, really. You know, really the biggest book about conservatism in U.S. history was still U.S. Richard Hofstadter's book on the paranoid sensibility, right? So a woman named Lisa McGurr wrote a book about Orange County, California, called Suburban Warriors, which was about women who sort of drove forward the grassroots conservative movement. And from that came a whole literature called The Rise of the New Right. What's been really interesting about that literature is then how much it sort of took for granted this kind of monolithic rise of a new right. And really failed to take account of all the evidence that was before every historian, that every historian sort of mustered into their book, that this conservative movement was really quite diverse. It was often at war with itself. There were a great many unresolved questions. There were aspirations that it didn't meet. And two of those aspirations that I think are really important, that are at the center of Natalia's book, are around race and sex. In the Reagan administration, when they took over, they saw the main failure of the Carter administration as dealing with identities or identity groups, right? And so one of the things they decided is they're not going to do that anymore. And furthermore, they're not going to deal with anybody who is not on their side. And so one of the things that happens in the Reagan administration is they say, you know, to talk about race is racism, all right? That's something that they're pulling out of this moment that Natalia is writing about. And then every once in a while something horrible would happen and they would get together all the black and Latino people in the White House and put them in one room and say, help us with this problem, right? So this problem that is at the center of conservatism, really, as it sort of moves into its ascendancy, has its roots in what Natalia is writing about. Now, of the things I learned from this book, one did not surprise me, and one did surprise me. The thing that did not surprise me was that the question of bilingual education cut across so many different racial lines and cut across individual identity groups so sharply, that class played such an important role in how people responded to this. That didn't surprise me. What I thought was amazing is that she documented something that nobody's ever documented before. So as we move into the next election cycle, we will hear more and more and more about the Latino vote, as we have in the past, and about how divided it is, and about how nobody understands it. But actually, if people did the kind of research that Natalia did, they would understand it. And, you know, really politics is going to depend on people being able to speak to this new majority in the kind of complex ways that it's actually constituted. So, that did not surprise me, but it amazed me. What did I learn that did surprise me? The part of the book about sex education struck home around a project I'm doing around the radical feminist anti-pornography movement. And one of the things at the center of that movement is a disagreement about how people learn about sex, all right? And one group of radical feminists says, pornography is how people learn about sex. And if pornography is bad and violent, they will learn to be bad and violent people. The other side says, don't be ridiculous. People have free will. People read things and learn them. They discard them. Other things come into the mix and so on. What surprised me about the work Natalia did is how deeply and profoundly both conservatives and liberals believed that you learn about sex in school. Now, how you respond to that is, depends on what kind of a position you're going to take about sex. But there is absolutely no question that people learned about sex in school. And in fact, one of the things she shows is that as she approaches the period that I'm writing about, the vast majority of the population, whether they were liberal or conservative, believed that sex ought to be the topic of education and that it could be done well. So this was interesting to me because it is so divorced from the conversation about pornography. And one of the things that's going to be my task in the coming months is to try and make sense of both of these things at the same time. But it imbues the anti-pornography conversation with a kind of richness based in community experiences of teaching and learning about sex. So I want to conclude, Natalia, by thanking you for this book. I learned an enormous number of things about it, and I will continue to learn from it.
Great. So first, in the spirit of Professor Buzzkill, I've been asked to remind folks, please not to lean on the fresco. We're saying, like, we get reminded of that. Like, something bad will happen to you later tonight if you don't pull away from this priceless fresco that surrounds us. Okay, so I'm going to say things that are in many ways building on what Claire and Jonathan have said. But before that, I'd like to join others in congratulating Natalia. Now, we write these books by guile, smarts, and mastery of craft. But every author also knows that they can only get completed with endless hours of painstakingly hard work. And a book like this is as much a triumph of stamina and tenacity as it is a triumph of the intellect. And then Natalia, step by step, just climb that lofty mountain. Some of the research is looking at the notes of a two-person pressure group in suburban Sacramento on a Wednesday night in 1973. Where did you turn up this? That's the nature of this, and you climb that lofty mountain step by step. So from the bottom, I want to wave to them and say congratulations. Okay. Now I'd like to, not summarize the content, which has already been done to some extent, and which Natalia will do later, but highlight three aspects of the book on which you might elaborate, later this evening. And the first is to say is that the book is very much a California story. Yes, California as bellwether, California's point of origin for a new kind of right-wing politics, but it's also very much about the peculiar politics and culture of the state over which I have long puzzled, especially when I lived in California for a year. And then that peculiar quality is the incredibly stark contradiction, where on the one hand, California is notoriously liberal. It gave us a big piece of gay liberation, psychedelic drugs, gangster rap, advances in marijuana cultivation, all kinds of lifestyle experimentation. Liberal Hollywood with its loose morals, LA is the infidelity capital of the world. The Chamber of Commerce celebrates the flaky California spirit. And yet it also has some of the most tenacious and nasty reactionary politics in the country, whether it's the tax revolts of the 1970s or the English, first and English only movement, some scary immigration stuff at the border, and then something I worked on, which was incredibly harsh assumptions about crime and punishment. And then the contradiction, hit me one day in California when by day I had gone to a rally in South Central Los Angeles on the 5th anniversary of the Three Strikes Law, where all these apoplectic relatives were talking about how their son, nephew, brother got locked up for life for, stealing a pizza or small possession. And then later that evening, I went to an ecstasy party in the hills of Santa Barbara, and the police didn't really seem to care about it much. And then granted, race and class sort of conditions, that kind of contrast. But I've always wondered, sort of how you reconcile these aspects of California. And then Natalia sort of demonstrated that it's not simply a red and a blue state demography awkwardly thrown into the same state, but there's some kind of symbiotic or dialectic relationship between the two, where the politics and left and right are mutually determining. So basically, I'd like to know, what you learned about the ties that bind Berserkly and Simi Valley. Okay, to sort of solve the mystery or the enigma that is California. Secondly, here I very much echo Jonathan, it's a story of the rise of conservatism, but very much at the grassroots. It's not a lot about Ronald Reagan and his handlers and the money men who sort of dreamed up the free market purge. It's very much conservatism at the grassroots. Stories of PTA moms, highly local officials, politicians who quietly built careers in state politics. And then she does not suffer the sin of condescension to these people. And then I wonder, whether and to what extent we've developed some genuine sense of empathy with and identification with these people with whom you certainly disagree about many things, and who you might even think are dangerous in some of their, views. And then these people may have been, sort of zealots of an agenda you don't favor, but they were also small d Democrats with an incredibly high sense of civic responsibility who tried to, remake the California polity in keeping with, deeply held values. And then I wonder what you think the reception will be among them, if they'll be grateful that you told their story with seriousness, or if it's poisoned by the secular humanism that you doubtless, embody here at the New School. And then I should say that, I wrote about left-wing revolutionaries in the 70s and had, at the same time period, very ambivalent relationships to them, where I identified deeply with some of their aspirations, but they were also kind of creepy. And then I'd like to hear your, sort of take. And then the last, this follows, I think, on sort of both Claire and Jonathan's, is that, you try to demonstrate the centrality of education wars to the rise of conservatism and the culture wars more broadly. And then the three things you focus on, as Claire mentioned, are battles over sex education, immigration and ethnicity, mostly having to do with the Latino question in California, and then beating back the corrosive radicalism of sort of tenured radicals and the young teachers who they had sort of ruined, who were teaching in the public school system. And then I'm interested if you could trace out a little bit the classroom wars within the culture wars and give us a sense of what the landscape is today. And then my sense is that education wars are less and less about content, though there is some concern with how evolution should be taught in various states, creationism, etc. But more and more, you see the education wars, push back against big government in the form of resistance to high-stakes testing that destroys, localism and dumbs down education by making it more about test scores than character. And then also, the kind of privatization push with a public school system as such has come into radical question. Part of the argument being that for disadvantaged populations condemned to suffer failing schools, this actually has an element of racial emancipation to it. So it seems that the value of limited government and a kind of anti-federalism has become more important than the social values that we normally think of as animating conservatism. And then I wonder if, like, A, I'm reading things rightly, B, have classroom wars persisted in a more classic sense, and then third, if California still has a privileged or dominant place in these battles, or has the state reached a kind of equilibrium of consensus around the things that they tore each other to pieces over 20 years ago. So that's it.
Thank you so much to everybody for being here. Now that I can turn around, I really see this very full room, and no one's leaning on the mural, so that's nice. And thank you to the history department for putting this on. This is amazing. I really could spend the next, it'll only be like 15 minutes, I promise, maximum. But I could spend all that time thanking pretty much everybody in this room for very different ways being there for me, from my parents, my brother, my kids, each of my children's births. Like were the deadlines for very important parts of this project. I'm like, you must send that before you go into labor. So I thank them in ways they don't even know. And then for these comments, I mean, this is really, everyone sort of very kindly mentioned how they originally knew me, but I'll tell you the other part of the story very briefly. I first read John's book, Who's America, as a first-year graduate student, and I said, that's the kind of thing I want to do. I don't know who this person is, but I want to do work like that. And then quickly read everything I could of his that I could. And then the first conference paper that I ever submitted, I submitted a single paper, which you're like not supposed to do, but I did. I ended up, with my first panel ever, on a panel with the John Zimmerman, which you can imagine that was slightly intimidating. But ever since then, you've taken me so kindly under your intellectual wing, so I really appreciate appreciate that. And then Claire, who I met at summer camp for historians, that same conversation I remember quite vividly, in part because I went home and was connecting with some friends in graduate school, and they're like, well, how is it? I'm like, I had lunch with Claire Potter today, and they're like, seriously? You know, so there's that dimension to it too. And then Jeremy has, I don't know, the privilege or the curse of having an office 3 doors down from me. So he's the one on whose door I knock most frequently, say, how do I revise this article? What should I do here? And so I'm so grateful for all the mentorship you've all provided in different ways, and for that of many other people in this room from graduate school. So I said I wouldn't spend the whole time doing that, but most of you here are in that acknowledgement, so thank you. Check it out. Okay, so what I want to do at this time is to tell you a little bit about the book. I think through some what I think are some cool images from the book. And I think I wrote down all these questions that all of you so thoughtfully posed. I think I can answer quite a few of them as we go, but I will also take a little time for anything I don't hit at the end, and then anything you all have to ask as well. Okay, so I was really fascinated as a graduate student so this book began as my dissertation research, as you might have guessed, and I was really I was in California, but I am about as East Coast as you get in many ways, and I really didn't want to do a regional study, just because the archives were there. But the more that I learned about California in the 60s and 70s, it seemed to me, kind of apropos of Jeremy's point, that, wow, this incredible range of political activity exists here, and political activity that would come to shape really 20th century, 21st century American politics. This was, as Claire mentioned in the historiography, I went into grad school just as all this kind of rise of the right literature was taking hold. So whereas we learned about the history of liberalism for so long, there was this whole slew of books saying actually conservatism, and a lot of it originating in California, had this big upsurge. So if you think about California in this period, yes, you have the kind of images of free love and anti-war demonstrations, but then increasingly we were learning about housewives in Orange County who were militating for guys like Max Rafferty, a very conservative superintendent who I cover in detail in this book. And so I was kind of sounding that all out, exploring it. And then one of the big things historiographically that struck me was that, all right, we now have this rich literature on the history of conservatism. We have this rich literature on the history of Latino culture and politics. These things, these two great historical phenomena, were literally taking place in the same districts, if not within miles from each other, and these two historiographers didn't talk to each other. So I thought, that's weird. That's really weird. I want to do something about that. So I was a former public school teacher, but it's not just because of that. I really realized that the classroom was a really interesting crucible for the way that all of these big political issues were playing out. And to the extent that many of these social movements were about these slippery concepts like patriotism, sexuality, morality, it's really hard to get a grasp as a historian on how to figure out how to track those things, but schools leave papers behind, lots and lots of papers. And so I realized the classroom was a place to figure it out. Now, schools in California were also a really interesting place. The most cliched thing about education in the United States is that it's very local and decentralized. True in California, but it was exceptionally centralized. They had this educational bureaucracy which had a lot of committees and met all the time and actually met with principals and superintendents. And so that was very good for me from a source perspective. Two, it was a very educationally adventurous place. There's one policymaker who I highlight in the book who said with great pride, in the 1960s, it was 3 months between the time that a journal article published something, a new idea in education, and when it appeared in the classroom. And so that meant that the whole country was really looking to California, either with great admiration or with great consternation of look at what those crazies are doing out there. Again, to your point, Jeremy, about the range of what existed there. And then also it was a place where these curricula, the ones I studied, bilingual ed and sex ed, but many, both reflected social change. It really was a point where you could see, okay, sex ed, that kind of came from the sexual revolution ethos. Bilingual ed, that came out of civil rights. But these curricula were also intended to manage these changes. There was a lot of the sensibility of, oh my gosh, these changes are coming, we in the schools better do something about it. And I think this book is full of big ideas played out in very small, detailed, kind of human ways. And these two pictures just really encapsulate a lot of the messy ways that happen. One, this is in 1969, that is a San Francisco classroom where there was a putatively multicultural celebration where instead of having Santa Claus, the tolerant thing to do was to make it Pancho Claus because there were so many Latinos in the class. That seemed to be a good idea, right? And so there you see these kids of various different races and ethnicity kind of like curiously touching his belly, but it shows that these grand ideas, and I read thousands of pages of this, about how do we make the schools more multicultural, played out sometimes in very awkward ways like that. Similar, and in very tame ways. Having a sombrero thrown on your santa is not exactly like radical pedagogy. And then the second one, that's from actually a Life, and that picture, I should say, was found in the archives. I don't know if anyone's ever seen it except for me, but this other one is actually from Life magazine in 1971. That's an example of a Southern California continuation school. These were special schools for pregnant girls. You see there's a pregnant girl on the chalkboard. And that to me was very interesting. That particular kind of school arose in this period, so it was very much, okay, we're not going to send away these wayward girls anymore to be outside of the school system, but they were still kind of separated and kept isolated in their own place. So I thought those two kind of get to some of these issues about the way these big ideas about ethnicity and sexuality play out. So bilingual and sex ed, why would you ever compare these two totally incongruous things? There are many reasons they are incongruous, but for purposes of right now, both emerged, as I said, from the social revolutions of the 60s and inspired fierce opposition. Both, if you actually looked at the content of the curriculum, and I read many, were very moderate or even conservative. Both introduced previously silenced topics to the classroom. There are, of course, before this era, real precedents, but there was a new energy to say, I think as Claire brought up, okay, we are going to talk about sex in the classroom. A lot of people did actually agree on that. My son out there. And also with language, if you think about the old narrative about immigration and linguistic minorities, it was sink or swim. This is the opposite. Well, we actually have to recognize these minorities. They also privileged the child. They said, we're going to look at you, a child, as an individual, whether it's because you're an ethnic minority with an identity you bring to the table, or even as an individual moral agent who might think differently than their parents. Also, there was this potential to clash with family authority. Sex educators got their biggest pushback from conservative parents who said, our morals say we don't talk about sex at school. You can't do that. That's my kid. He or she's an extension of me. And sex educators said, well, actually, we want to teach them to have their own values. Similarly with Latino kids, parents said, hey, you have to recognize our linguistic background, our heritage in the classroom. The answer to them was actually different. No, the school is a totally neutral space, you know. We're not gonna deal with that there. Ultimately, most of the sex ed parents won out and the Latino parents less so. All of this is hashed out against the background of desegregation. So most of the images, if you think about what are the education stories in the 1960s and 70s, you imagine Boston busing riots, you imagine African-American kids not being allowed to walk into schools. That's absolutely a huge part of this, but it really, and it really is the backdrop, even in communities where black-white desegregation was not a big issue. One of my favorite examples is someone said to this mother in a very, very white community, so why are you so freaked out about sex education in your school? And she goes, well, I heard that after sex ed class, they put on wild African music and have all the children dance in the dark. And it's like, really? Your community is 99% white, but there was this real fear of racial mixing that permeated all of this. And both of these issues actually are rarely synthesized into our historical narrative of political history. And then again, to Claire's point, there's both a kind of deepening of this rise of the right narrative in here. These were part of the forging of conservatism, but there's also a kind of pushback to it. That I think there was this persistent progressivism that both of these programs helped install in American schools, not just in California. So I'll say a little bit about where these came from, and then I'll open it up for questions. So bilingual education we think of as this kind of quintessentially lefty progressive program. But first of all, it did exist since the 19th century, not about Spanish. And after 65, because of a big immigration act, the idea was this is a Mexican-American problem. But the idea was, what was interesting is that this broad coalition took it up. This education of the Mexican-American was put together by one of the most conservative, a guy who made his name as being a conservative, Max Rafferty. He met with the Minister of Education in Mexico and said, we should really get a textbook exchange doing, because Anglo kids have every responsibility to learn Spanish the way Latino kids have a responsibility to learn English. And that's, within 5 years, he would back away from that completely, but that's a real fluidity that we didn't really know about before. And then this, I think, speaks to Jeremy's point. This guy in the middle, Eugene Gonzalez, who's like my quiet hero of this narrative, and part quiet, I say, because he has none of his own papers that I can find. He was really an example of somebody who struggled with the range of sensibilities in California in this period, and also what it meant to be a Latino man, working for a very conservative superintendent and hashing out all of these issues. Yeah, and I can say more about that in the question if you want. By 1968, the polarization that we're maybe a little bit more aware of begins to exist. LBJ signs into law, the Bilingual Education Act, the Chicano power movement takes place, so they get a lot of energy with the left and thus inspire a huge reaction from the right. And this book is a lot about showing the way that kind of got hashed out. I won't go through this. Well, you know what? I'll just move on, and I can speak about that later if you want. Sex at school. So at the same time, there are all of these fights percolating around sex education. And now what's interesting is that, as John's pointed out before, all of these sex education programs worked really hard to kind of vary the sex and privilege the family in their titles. Hence titles like Family Life and Sex Education, Family Life Education. And what they really didn't want to be known as was sex instruction, which is what conservatives tarred them as. These are programs to teach your kids how to have sex. To give you a sense of how moderate many were, check out that cartoon over there. I don't know if you can read the caption. You'll enjoy dating much more if you arrange your plans in keeping with your other obligations. This was like standard fare in the sex ed curriculum this period. Much broader curriculum, not just talking about kind of reproduction, talking about life and kind of managing a household and responsibilities, but these very like conformist, moderate claims of what it meant to be a good citizen, and sex was bound up in that. That being the case, a lot of conservatives got quite worked up about this. Right here you see is the schoolhouse was proper place to teach raw sex. This is like almost a Bible.
Yes.
This is almost a Bible of the kind of anti-sex education movement. It was a pamphlet. It sold about 1 million copies, published by Christian Crusade minister Gordon B. Drake, and this really fired up a lot of local sensibilities. Down here, that's just the top. I wanted to give you the whole thing, but you know, you read the book to see the whole thing, but this was typical of these local newsletters that usually women in these local groups put together saying what those kind of programs represented. You know, do your homework, but actually that's a plot by UNESCO, the WHO, the NEA to turn your kids into sex slaves. So it was very interesting. These programs did mention masturbation and homosexuality, which was unprecedented, but it was usually to say, like, that's not such a great idea. But the idea that they were even mentioning them was really incendiary. So how did these two things come together? So I discovered these amazing papers in the archives. It was crazy. It was one of these archival stories. I was alone in Sacramento. It was like 100 degrees. I discovered these papers. I'm like, I want to just tell the world about this. And there was no Facebook yet. Who walks into the archives with John Zimmerman? I'm like, it's a mirage. The only person who might care about this, right? And so that was very nice. But so the Moral Guidelines Committee, Governor Reagan, you might recognize the younger version of a very familiar face. He looked at these sex ed dramas and he said the Moral Guidelines Committee must lead California out of the moral decay into which it is descending. This is the single most important task facing the state. That's pretty intense, right? It's pretty crazy to think that sex education looms so large. So Reagan and his right-hand man Rafferty, there he is when he was running for Republican candidacy for Senate in '68, they put together this stacked committee. They said, hey guys, and a few women, put together moral guidelines for California, but by the way, the Supreme Court says we can't mention God anymore. So figure out some kind of morality that doesn't talk about God in the public schools. And they figured, because it was their conservative appointees, this would be a very kind of conservative document. So a conservative document emerged. The Board of Ed, the State Board of Ed roundly rejected it. And what ended up happening, and there's like a lot of detail to this, but what ended up happening is there was a kind of liberal takeover within that committee, and a very liberal document actually ended up winning. A liberal document that, yes, knit together these ideas about patriotism and nationhood and morality, but did it so in the sense, and this gets to a lot of your questions of, America is an amazing nation. We must teach our children to respect it, but we haven't quite realized our potential yet. This is so different. The conservative document that they put out before was like, secular humanists are going to take over your children and turn them into masturbating sex slaves. We must root them out immediately. Go. Like really, it was like that intense of a difference. And so that was the first thing to me that kind of turned on my brain to say, okay, well, this wasn't all about the rise of the right. There was a kind of persistent progressivism, which I argue still endures today in some ways, even though, I think to the point both Jeremy and John made, the lines of liberal and conservative have changed a lot today. So the legacies, we know about this rise of the right story, and I think that's probably most familiar to people in this room, but I found that they're actually, oopsie, I don't know what mine is, there you go. I think at the same time we see a kind of consistent progressivism or continued progressivism we don't really know. In terms of sex ed, you go and you read the newspapers about sex ed in the 70s, this thing is spreading all over California, is one of the common refrains. Our Bodies Ourselves, the kind of quintessential feminist health book, comes out in 1971, used in some of these California programs. It would have put to shame anything that these conservatives were freaking out about not 5 years before. Here's a student newspaper where you really also see this kind of new morality. These students saying, yeah, we want family life classes back. They don't say sex in there, by the way, which is kind of interesting in their school paper. It's a minority that wants to leave these out. And so you see that it continues to spread. And when I read thousands of articles and letters in the archives, I saw also that the complaints were no longer, communists want to take over your kids through sex ed. They were like, well, you had 2 homosexual speakers last year, that was a little excessive, maybe you should just have 1 this year. I mean, the rhetoric and the tenor kind of tamped way, way, way down, which was interesting. At the same time, with bilingual education, one of the arguments I make in the book is that we have a great history, and John is in part very responsible for the writing of that history, about how we got multiculturalism education today. Most of those histories written tend to focus on history education as the primary vehicle for where our ideas about multiculturalism came from. I show, I think pretty convincingly, every bilingual program was always in some way a bilingual, bicultural program. And you really see this shift, I think, embodied in a place called Mission High School. Is there anyone from San Francisco here, just out of curiosity? No? Okay, then you're not going to call me out. No, I'm just kidding. I do know that. But I do always like to know. Mission High School was always an immigrant high school in San Francisco. And I came across this interview with some people who attended Mission High School in like the 1940s and 50s. It was established in 1896. And they said, oh, well, you know, what do you think of Mission High? And they said, well, the good thing about Mission High is none of us live in that neighborhood anymore. We've all passed through. We're all successful. We don't even know each other anymore, because the thing about Mission High is it makes you an American. In the 1970s, Mission High School became a center of Latino culture in San Francisco, covered with murals of Latino culture. There was a Latino music festival, and the mayor of San Francisco actually chose that site to announce his candidacy, in part as a celebration of the preservation of ethnic and cultural rights. That to me suggests a real shift, just you see through this one institution, in ideas about multiculturalism. So I will finish by, with this curious quote I came across. The public schools have gotten confused about what they should be teaching. This is by Senator Hayakawa, who was, by this point in 1980, the most renowned, renowned is probably the wrong word, the most well-known champion or opponent to bilingual education. He was really the founder in many ways of the English Only Initiative. And he's writing in the Sex Education and Mental Health Report, which is interesting, about his kind of disillusionment with American schools in this period. And so the argument that I kind of try to make, and you can see in much more elaborate ways in the book, is that sex education, bilingual education, really became knit as people started to bring together these ideas about nation and morality and the way the public schools were dealing with that. And then this kind of disillusionment that you see here, which I think speaks to everybody's comments, what changes after this period, and maybe this responds most directly to Jeremy in some ways, what changes after this period I study, and I close in the early 1980s, is that in many ways, in the period I studied, there was this shared sense that the public schools were worth fighting for. Chicano radicals, hardcore conservatives, they all were going to battle over what was going to happen in their local schools. After 1978, in part because of Proposition 13, which was an anti-tax revolt, which really killed a lot of the funding for public schools in California, due to another measure which made it more financially viable to go to religious education, there was just kind of a shift in that shared sensibility. More people could go outside the public school system for their education. So you don't have that shared terrain. So that's kind of the end, that is the end of my formal presentation, but to pick up on a couple of things that you said just specifically, I think this is taking John and Jeremy's point together. I think that if we try and trace the lines to today, these individual issues in many ways are no less controversial. You see all the time. I mean, especially hot, for some reason social media just loves sex education, but you know, there are these big outcries over you know, in one Mississippi school, it's an outrage that they take a chocolate and they unwrap it and pass it around the room and say, well, this is what a girl is who sleeps with someone before marriage. Do you really want to be that chocolate? And everyone's like, no, right? So that causes an outcry in some places. But by the same token, in other communities, you have these like much more radical programs where people are talking about transgender rights and you know, changing our use of pronouns, and then you see an outcry over that. So you see a real range of what exists in sex education. Similarly, there are other issues with ethnic studies, which correspond to bilingual ed. But I think to both of your points, what I think is most interesting about this whole privatization and choice perspective is that in some ways it's now something that liberals and conservatives can agree on. Absolutely, one is choice, and two, within this market framework in many ways, because what is a market framework if not a privileging of someone's individual power of choice? So I think that is a real shift in many ways. At the same time, I don't necessarily think that the kind of privatization arguments and the things about charter schools are as much about divergent worldviews as these issues were. Few people who are anti-charter and anti-privatization are like towing a Marxist line about that, right? It's not really a battle of worldviews, I think, in the same way. And one other thing I want to answer directly, and I'll open it to you. I know I've probably gone on far too long, but it could have been way longer. There were like 40 slides. The other thing I'll say directly to Jeremy's point about did I find sympathy with some of the people that I was talking to, well, who I don't necessarily agree with. It's probably no secret I definitely have a kind of progressive politics, and this book was about taking people seriously who don't have those politics. And yes, I came into, for example, people would assume who are very conservative that I just obviously agree with them. For example, I was in the living room of these very kind retired teachers in Garden Grove, California, and they like made me tea and cookies, and it was so nice. And we talked for like 2 hours, and then they were like, so go back to Stanford and tell those hippies they ruined it. You know what I'm talking about, right? And I'm like, totally. You know, and so that was interesting, and how people just kind of assume that you agree with them, even if I don't necessarily. At the same time, I don't agree with most of, particularly the conservative opposition to these programs. At the same time, they had some points. For example, what did it take to get certified to be a sex ed teacher when these programs first started coming out in the late 60s? Nothing. I have all these quotes from teachers. Well, it was August, I got a letter, they were doing a 1-week workshop. That seemed like a good idea, so I did it, and then in September I was teaching sex ed. The conservative argument is like, yeah, and the self-selected pervs who do those programs, right? We don't want teaching our kids. And I take issue with that presumption, but I mean, that's not exactly robust teacher training. And just one more example like that, though, which is a real problem as a historian and as a impartial person pursuing the truth, as recent as it is. So one program which I studied in great detail in San Mateo was probably the most famous sex ed program in the whole country in 1968. It was called Time of Your Life. And the Wall Street Journal covered it, the New York Times, everything. It was very, very inflammatory. The guy who created that program, Dr. William Ayers, he was the head of, kind of Pediatric Psychology Association, very well regarded. In 2008, he got brought up on child abuse charges for the whole era that I was talking about, and ended up going to jail, actually. And so that was very interesting. I need to blog about that somewhere. It's in a footnote in the book, but I don't think his opponents were right necessarily on the big picture issues, but they were right in many ways that this particular guy really had some proclivities which were, not what you would want in your educator. So I will stop there. I'd love, it's so generous of all of you to come out, so I'd love to hear any questions and comments from you. But thank you so much. Please.
My name is Mary Hilschutz. I feel like, in some ways, having progressive politics and my daughter's in her 20s now, but being a mother who lived through some of these things in New York City, trying to get her into this public school and all these things. I feel like I'm sort of a veteran of some of the things that you're talking about. There's so many questions that occur to me, but one thing I was thinking about when you were talking about the intersection of the way the sex education conflict was framed and the bilingual education conflict was framed is that although these battles take place locally, to some degree they're also, as well as being national, they're also global. Post 9/11, there was a conflict in New York about a woman named Debbie Almontasser, who I know a little bit, who wanted to start a public middle school called the Philad Brand School. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about the applications of the things you sort of with post 9/11.
So the global expert on these issues is John Zimmerman, whose new book on the global crisis over sex education, I think, speaks to the global perspective on that. So you're saying what's the in a post 9/11 world? Yeah, well, I think it's funny. So I teach a culture wars class, and the big question now in post 9/11 is what's the new kind of culture wars framework? And I think a lot of that in some ways will go back to the teaching of history and how we will or will not involve in the U.S. a history of America's relationship to the Middle East. I mean, that's already being hashed out, and how much that will be a kind of patriotic, uncritical patriotic narrative, and how much it won't be. So you do see that in many different schools right now. Thank you.
I know that this is not the subject of your book, but I wonder, it seems to me, and this is really, just as a citizen, not as an historian, that we've really seen sort of the destruction of the public school system in the last 20 years or so. And it seems to me the public school system, the so-called common school, has been absolutely, the foundation. And I love what you said. I love the discussion because it brings out the way in which it has been the foundation of American democracy. So I just wonder what your reflections about this are. I actually have experienced this myself, having a grandson who, is in a public school, and 40 kids in a class and so forth.
I think you're. Well, I think this gets back to this question. This gets back to the question so many of us have raised, right, about the end. And I think Hayakawa's quote is right too. At the end of this kind of shared commitment to public education, and I can say maybe perhaps also less as a historian and more as a parent of a kindergartner in a public school here in New York City, that one of the things that is pretty depressing is you see that even in those of us who putatively are part of the public education system, the differences between any public school in New York or any two public schools are enormous. I look at our school, which is literally on this corner right here. At the beginning of the year, we get a wish list for the kids. We all buy the stuff for the kids, and there's an auction, and the PTA raises lots of money. It's a great school I want my kids to go to, right? But then when you think about the way that depoliticizes any of us from standing up for much less resource schools because of what we can do privately for our own school, I mean, it's totally depressing, right? And then I think, so that's one piece of what you're talking about. And then the other piece of it, I think, is also just this kind of celebration of choice and choice within the public school system even, but also choice to opt out creates some real kind of sinkholes in the educational system, which are really hard to repair. So I'm going to finish it. Yeah, Federico.
Yes, I have one question also as a citizen and a historian, but the question is historical. Because at one point you said that there was, there were some differences or some distinctions in the sense that people representing a conservative position in the past were, and those opposing it, were engaged in certain, let's say, traditions of philosophy, class thought or class analysis. Invoking Marx or criticizing Marx and so on and so forth. And yet, even without that kind of self-understanding or experience, when you read in the paper that there is a charter movement which is supported by, the richest men on earth, and they want really to go against public education as we know it, then what, because you were emphasizing the differences. So my question is, even acknowledging those differences, which are the continuities, or how they relate?
The continuities from this period about regarding...
And the charter movement in the present, because it seems that...
I knew we get some charters. I'm trying to think. Well, I think the thing that's remarkable about today is that some of these charter movements that you hear about that are backed by hedge funds, et cetera, that they also get the buy-in of the so-called, what you would think of as a kind of liberal progressive coalition, right? That all, even just think, it's really too controversial to bring up now, but there's been a lot of criticism of Teach for America for the same reason, right? But the kids that are going to Teach for America are all of those kind of liberal-minded, progressive, save-the-worlders who are in many ways going to be if you see it as a problem, part of that problem of kind of privatization in charter schools. So I think to me the kind of ideological shift there is that you have this kind of shared space between a hedge fund billionaire and a kind of well-meaning liberal college graduate who are all participating in something which might arguably go against a real kind of left progressive tradition in educational politics. I think that might get to your question. I don't know. Go ahead, yeah, and tell me who you are.
Yeah, my name is Kareem McQuilkin. From Brooklyn, New York. This is my 5th year teaching high school in Brooklyn, New York, and I have the luxury of teaching not too far from where I grew up. Great. And what you said about your professor when you were writing and you found somebody who actually cared about what you were writing about is actually inspirational to me, because sometimes you feel like, who cares about these things? So, and I found out about this through an old professor of mine who told me about the new school, and I ran into it kind of by accident. So I just wanted to let you know that's inspirational.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you. That's so kind of you.
Definitely. And I'm somebody who's interested in reading what you've written.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, definitely.
Thank you for.
So now there are 2 of us.
Yes. Thank you for. I was going to say thank you for coming and for teaching. I mean, it's a huge thing. Thank you. That's so kind of you to come. I appreciate it. We'll stay in touch, definitely. Anyone else? Thoughts? Comments? Neil.
Can you say something about your children as historical actors? Like, how much are you historicizing?
My own children?
No.
Oh, okay. 3 and 5. 2012
Sorry.
Year, yeah.
Your historical.
Oh, my historical children.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Are
they're
they agents in this story?
Absolutely. So children are historic. I'm like, oh God. Children are historic. The voice of children are very, very hard to capture for historians, because even though schools leave a lot of paper behind, kids tend not to. However, I ran into some gold mines of sources here, which were just absolutely phenomenal. One was, I can't believe anyone kept this, boxes of student evaluations of sex education. I mean, most people would find that and throw that in the garbage. I was like high-fiving the archivist, like, thank you for doing this. And so that's one way, and that was one of the most fascinating things, because you think you get a gold mine and you find just the prescriptive curricular material. But for example, this one I'm reading, and it says, you know, I'm so happy in the senior problems class that we talked about homosexuality, and I'm thinking, wow, this really was a progressive curriculum, because now I know how sick these people are. And all that. You know, or the same. These were high school students and senior problems class in Anaheim, California. And by the same token, in that same box, there was another girl who said, I'm so happy we finally got to talk about sex. No one's ever talked to me about sex before, because I would never have known not to be that kind of girl, because no one would want to marry me. And it's like you saw the way that even though these liberal, progressive programs, which were vilified as kind of commie sex slave things, really fell differently on kids. Similarly, I read a lot of student newspapers, and that was really interesting to see the way this new morality, which everyone talked about, permeated the kids. It was also interesting that all of the conservative actors tended to paint the children as these quiet, innocent victims, worthy of their protection. The minute kids start talking, it gets real awkward. I have one hearing that I cover in the book where this parent is saying, these children are innocent, and a kid gets up and is like, I actually think sex education is really important, we should talk about this more. And the mother, who isn't the kid's mother, says like, oh, shut up, I bet you're not even a virgin anyway. And everyone's like, pipe down, you know, and so you kind of see that the kids have this different perspective. At the same time, from a, not on the granular level, but from a kind of grand historical process level, you know, this is the moment of also a bunch of Supreme Court cases about children's rights, and obviously all these youth rights movement. So you see kids articulating their rights as citizens, as students in new ways. The Chicano walkouts were all about that. They weren't just about bilingual ed and sex ed. They were like, we want jukeboxes in the cafeteria, we want to wear short skirts, and you know, and so there was this idea that like we have rights as young people. And so I did as much as I could, newspapers, those evaluations, yearbooks. I interviewed a lot of people. They obviously weren't children anymore. At the time, there was this, I don't even know if it exists anymore, this was pre the kind of social media we have today. There was something called classmates.com. Does that still exist? But I set up an account as a member of the class of the high schools that I was studying. And I said, I didn't front as if I was one of these people, but I said, put your class in history. And I got all these amazing interviews that I did, some of which, like there was this one, it was a man and a woman I was interviewing, and the woman told me this whole dramatic story about getting pregnant and being sent away, and I am convinced that the man was the man who got her pregnant. I never told, because of the stories that they were telling, I could like conceivably ruin their lives with being traumatized, so I never did anything with that. But it was really interesting to get to talk to people, and even to see through their eyes of memory, and to treat it accordingly. But yeah, what was your question? Well, there's California wine out there. I insisted on it.